Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison. I want to welcome you to this session of Humanity Rising on the 27th of June, 2025. I come with optimism and a glimmer of hope today that I want to start with, and then I'll provide context and finish up with Sauron Mamdani, who, as many of you may know, just won the Democratic nomination for being mayor of New York, carrying an explicitly democratic socialist agenda, talking about affordability, taking a very strong position on the Israeli genocide in Gaza, calling for the arrest of Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, for war crimes. And he won 43% of the vote in the face of the largest war chest ever assembled in New York City by the establishment Democrats, Hillary and Bill Clinton in the lead, but Senator Schumer and Hakeem in the House, Hakeem Jeffries to support Andrew Cuomo, the former governor of New York, who had to resign in disgrace after 11 women charged him with sexual harassment and sexual predation of various kinds a number of years ago. And he was running as the establishment favorite. And 33-year-old Ugandan immigrant who used to play hip hop music on the streets of New York and then had a passion for politics, beat him in what was essentially a replay of the 2016 presidential election, where Bernie Sanders, rising in the polls, was finally uh, uh, overthrown by Hillary and Bill Clinton and the Democratic establishment and deprived of the nomination, which had he won, which he deserved, I believe the recent history of the United States would have been fundamentally changed. And this time, the playbook of the establishment Democrats was overthrown by a democratic socialist taking a strong position on the genocide in Gaza. And the implications of this are potentially, I say and emphasize, potentially seismic if we, the American people, can seize the moment and understand the larger context of why this election in New York could be either a false hope crushed by the establishment or the first beacon of light that we've had in some time. And I want to return to Mamdani later in the program, but I want to frame uh, the context for why and how this is happening. And I want to start by just summarizing what has been happening in the Middle East with the U.S.-Israeli attack on Iran within the larger context of full spectrum dominance and imperial collapse, because what happened in New York is integrally connected with the larger picture of unfolding geostrategic events. One of the basic factors in imperial collapse is the two phenomena of denial and thinking that all problems can be solved through war. And we're seeing this being played out in many areas over the last 60 years as the United States has fought senseless wars at vast expense, causing unimaginable human suffering and destruction, and then losing those wars, starting with Vietnam and continuing in a number of countries, including, as we all know, Afghanistan and Iraq, Libya, and a variety of other countries around the world. The empire, inflexible in its moral core, feels that there's only one way to respond to its deteriorating geostrategic position, and that is to fight more wars, which have the ironic result of actually hastening its decline because it actually empowers the enemies that array themselves against it in a larger and larger coalition dedicated to its demise. There are many points that one can make about what has been recently unfolding in Iran, but I want to use the time we have today to explore how it is a microcosm of the macrocosm by teasing out the irony and the paradox of what has taken place. Benjamin Netanyahu, as I've described before, since the mid 1990s, has been talking about the absolute urgent national security imperative to essentially upend the geostrategic balance of power in the Middle East by invading and destroying one country after another. He called for the invasion of Afghanistan. He was in the lead in saying that there was weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. He has called for the destabilization and destruction of Lebanon and Syria and Somalia and Sudan. And of course, Yemen with the Houthis, and now Iran, in a policy of divide and conquer with a strategic goal that has been implemented for the Israelis to deploy invincible power throughout the region, destabilizing all the Arab states, ensuring that Israel is the only country with nuclear weapons, and force a situation in which the Muslim and Arab nations come into subservience, as Jordan and Egypt have, for example, under the economic hegemony of the United States, such that they do not challenge Israel either politically or militarily, or the United States is going to deprive them of economic aid and overthrow the monarchy as it is in Jordan and the dictatorship as it is in Egypt, and install a more subservient servant, which the United States has done, as we all know, in over 100 countries since the ending of the Second World War. The first one of which was in 1953 when it overthrew the Mossadegh government democratically elected in Iran and thereby initiated a chain of consequences. What Edward Gibbon, in his masterwork, The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, called the inescapable, inexorable logic of unintended consequences against which even the Caesars, he said, could not stand. And what we've seen in Iran is that chain of unintended consequences that led to the rise of the revolution in 1979, the taking of the hostages uh, in the US embassy, and the establishment of a regime that, unlike the Shah that the US imposed after the 1953 coup, has been a militant opponent of the United States and Israel, and has formed the axis of resistance with Hezbollah and Hamas and the Houthis and the Mujahideen in Syria and in Iraq. And now, as a result of the recent events where the United States and Israel went in with a dual purpose of eliminating the nuclear capacity of Iran. And now intelligence information indicates it didn't do that at all, because in fact, the Israelis had emptied Fordo and the other nuclear facilities that were bombed, and took the enriched uranium and the centrifuge equipment to places that are hidden and no one knows where they are. And secondly, they thought if they decapitate the Iranian leadership, the people of Iran would rise up and overthrow the mullahs and establish a pro-US, pro-Israel regime like the Shah in the aftermath of the 1953 coup. And the reverse has happened. The regime now is stronger in the aftermath of the decapitation strikes as it was before the decapitation strikes. And its nuclear capacities remain. The irony of this is that this drive for full spectrum dominance is ultimately unsustainable. Iran has announced that it's breaking relations with the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency. There's more pressure than ever now on the Ayatollah, on the leadership in Iran to develop nuclear weapons, because they've come to see that only with nuclear weapons can they stop escalating US and Israel attacks, because the ceasefire will not hold. We all need to be really clear about that. And the US and Israelis are now caught in their own contradictions. It's very interesting. Donald Trump was persuaded to attack Iran. The Israelis brought over the head of Mossad, the head of the Israeli secret service, their equivalent to the CIA, to brief the president personally and the national security apparatus that surrounds the president, and convince them that, like the weapons of mass destruction back in the Iraq War, where Mossad said the same thing, the Iranians were only possibly even days away from getting a nuclear weapon. So Trump authorized it, according to the information that has surfaced, for the Israelis to attack. And then he was watching Fox News and he saw that the Fox News was celebrating 24/7, this great triumph and decapitation of the Israelis against the regime, the possibilities of regime change and eliminating the head of the snake. And so he thought he would just go in and finish the job and, as we saw, claim credit for obliterating totally Iran's nuclear capacity and ending the 12-day war, as he called it, and initiating, having violated the negotiations that were already going on, initiating a new era of peace with his eye on the Nobel Peace Prize, which Pakistan, only 24 hours before Trump sent the stealth B-2 bombers to drop apparently 14 bunker buster bombs on Iran, had nominated him for the Nobel Peace Prize. And now the ridicule of Trump in the international press, because there was no obliteration, there was no neutralization of the Iranian nuclear capacities, now is setting up the continuation of the escalation that the Israelis have been planning for and will continue to agitate for as they drag the United States against its own strategic interest into more war. And this senseless accident in slow motion as the imperium can no longer differentiate, as we see with President Trump, between the fantasies in his mind and the reality that Iran is now stronger strategically and in world public opinion than it was before the attack, and is building the alliance structure with Russia, with China, with the other BRICS nations, as the world beholds the reign of stupidity in Washington, consistent with the collapse of virtually all imperial systems. And it's within this context that I want to go inside now the collapsing imperium by way of explaining the importance of Zahran Mamdani. What happens internally while the collapse is happening in slow motion externally? The increased disparity between the rich and the poor, which is a consistent indicator of imperial collapse, has been playing itself out in the United States really for the last 40 to 50 years. And I think the transition moment was the Clinton administration in the 1990s. After the Reagan administration and the Bush senior administrations took the American superpower apparatus to its apogee moment, signaled by the collapse of its principal opponent, the Soviet Union in December of 1991, which we've spoken about multiple times, and I won't go into it today because I want to track the internal processes that began to happen inside the United States right at the moment of full spectrum dominance over the planet and this exuberance by the neocons that finally, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, the United States reigned supreme over the world. What was happening internally? That's the key to understanding Zoran Mamdani. It was at that moment that US policymakers made two strategic blunders, the consequences of which have led to the present day. The first one was to refuse Gorbachev's proposal to use the ending of the Cold War to create what he called the beginnings, the foundations of a global civilization. We've talked about that. NATO moved to the east, and it's ended up with the United States and NATO losing the Ukraine war as the Russians took a stand and have actually emerged victorious. Internally, the United States made the decision to move from manufacturing, building its infrastructure, building the middle class, to a policy of free trade and globalization, whereby US corporations could go to Mexico or go to Brazil, or most importantly, go to China, build their manufacturing facilities cheaper, and the United States would maintain global hegemony, not as a big manufacturing power, because it was cheaper to do it in the former colonies in a neo-colonial apparatus reinforced by the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund and the World Trade Organization and the General Agreement of Trade and Tariffs, all these international organizations serving the financial supremacy and the economic agenda of the United States, and I would say the G7. You take your manufacturing, you take it offshore, and you forget the middle class, which was the transition of the Clintons, which had been the foundation of the Democratic Party, because now they don't matter, because manufacturing in the United States doesn't matter. We want to control the world through military bases and through the supremacy of the US dollar secured by Saudi Arabia beginning in 1972, when the United States went off the gold standard and the dollar was tagged to oil. And as long as all oil was bought and sold in US dollars, it became the reserve currency for the world. That was the strategy of the United States political class, both Democrat and Republican, in this transitional moment after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the establishment of the unipolar moment. But what nobody saw happening, and this is this chain of unintended consequences, is that with the collapse of the middle class inside America, the core of America began to be hollowed out. And the victims were many. But at the heart of the collapse was the white males participating in the unions, which before the transition to corporate from manufacturing were basically strong in America. And the development of this bi-coastal high tech in California and Silicon Valley, high stock markets in Wall Street as globalization took place. And this basic message to the Rust Belt in the Midwest and in the South and in the mountain states, where factories were closed and unions were broken and schools could no longer be supported because the tax base was gone, was a collapse of the American core. And it wasn't this time just the people of color. It was the white people, the evangelical Christians, the foundational core, the Puritan core of the American polity. And they began to realize that not only were they left out, but they were blamed for not being able to get it together. As if somehow the loss of the manufacturing and the fact that they no longer had jobs was their fault. And then they had to deal with what the Democrats did simultaneously as they moved from manufacturing, moved from the middle class, began to receive massive amounts of money from the corporate class, is they began to develop diversity, equity, and inclusion, and identity politics. And this is important to understand. Traditionally, the left in the United States has been Marxist. Workers of the world unite, build the trade unions, support the manufacturing, the dignity of labor. The attack by the right that happened in the Reagan administration and in the Bush administration was so effective that essentially the left in America collapsed because they could no longer use the L word, liberalism, and they could no longer use the S word, socialism, because it was pilloried and mercilessly ridiculed in the media. Nobody wanted to be a socialist. You couldn't win an election, even for dog catcher, if you were a socialist and believed that the government should provide free health care or free education or free buses, like Mamdani is talking about in New York. So where did the left go? The left went into identity politics. The collapse of the economic base for the left spawned the generation in the 1990s and subsequently of DEI, which further alienated the white males and the Rust Belt and that middle class that with the collapse of manufacturing no longer had jobs, no longer had any dignity. And it was coterminous with all that, just to recall some aspects of this, that you had the explosion of the opioid pandemic across that demographic of people. Rise of alcoholism, total despair, suicide rates. So that became the elixir, the toxic cauldron of Donald Trump. And the rise of the tyrant. And the Republicans understood, because they're masters of wedge issues and have been since the 1970s, with President Nixon's famous Southern strategy. Remembering at that time, the Democratic Party, coming out of the great triumphs of Franklin Delano Roosevelt in the 1930s and the 1940s, building the middle class, building Social Security and Medicare and workers' comp and all the accoutrements, strong education, strong unions. They dominated politics for 50 years in the United States until Richard Nixon's Southern strategy, which he deployed very successfully in 1968 and again in 1972, and set forth the agenda of the Republican Party. And that is law and order, which was the code term for racism. Remember the Willie Horton ads, letting them out of jail, and then they rape our women, and all the things that began to happen in the political ads in 1968 and then in 1972. It's an extraordinary, extraordinary strategy. And it worked. And beginning with Richard Nixon toward Jimmy Carter and then with Ronald Reagan, the Republican Party swept the South with using these code words that reinforced the racist ideology, the Christian dominionist ideology. So finally, the South, which had been traditionally Democrat for 100 years since the Civil War, became completely Republican. And if you remember the Powell memo of 1972, it was the articulation of a 50-year strategy by the Republicans to effectuate these policies by building up from the local to the state to the national level, the hold of the Republican Party in state after state, using this divisive culture war tactic to exacerbate divisions and racism and Christian dominionism, which, as the middle class collapsed, given the globalist policies of the United States in its unipolar moment, began to feed that cauldron that led to the election in 2016 of Donald Trump, a demagogue who has a masterful capacity of exacerbating all the contradictions that have been created in the psyches of the collapsed middle class, particularly the white males, that you're the victim, that it's those people of color coming over the border that are your enemy, that diversity, equity, inclusion is just a code term for getting more colored people into the country so they can vote Democrat. And Christians are now victims because all these books supporting DEI and gender sovereignty and all these other things are coming into our libraries. They're brainwashing our kids. That plays into that victim consciousness and led to what we've seen in America over the last 10 years, as now manipulating these tendencies. Donald Trump has come in with the theory of the unitary presidency to consolidate complete authoritarian control. Maintaining the military supremacy abroad, consolidating military supremacy, authoritarian supremacy at home. This is how democracies die. This is how empires collapse. It's an inexorable process of history, so far without exceptions, except one. You know, in the late first century in Rome, after the complete disastrous reigns of Nero and Caligula and others that brought the Roman infrastructure to the brink of collapse, the Roman Senate in 98 AD, desperate to try to find a way to solve this problem, made a move that was so simple and yet so profound that it created the basis of what historians call the Second Golden Age, which lasted 100 years. They appointed an elderly senator named Nerva, who didn't last very long, but had the good sense to appoint a Spanish general named Trajan that for the first time broke this patrimony of father and son and basically Romans, Italians running the empire, because Nerva understood that what was required was competence, not military prowess. And for the next 100 years, each one of the Caesars who was chosen because of his competence did not pass the empire to his sons, but chose the next emperor on the basis of who was the best person to lead the empire. That collapsed in the late second century with Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher emperor. If you read his meditations, he was a Stoic, but he made a huge mistake. And he was persuaded by his wife to allow his son, Commodus, to succeed him. And Commodus, like the emperors before Nerva, was like Trump, mentally unstable and functionally completely incompetent. And that then triggered the collapse of the imperium because Rome never regained its equilibrium. It's an extraordinary story that's often missed by history, that collapse can be at least delayed if the leadership makes a few wise decisions. And it's within this context that I want to return to Zohran Mamdani, because I think we're at a choice point where the people of New York, like the Roman Senate 2,000 years ago, have made a choice to bring in a young man who's exactly what America needs. I made the point earlier that the Clintons and the Democratic establishment squelched Bernie Sanders back in 2016 and again in 2020. But old Bernie Sanders, boy, he's never given up. And along with AOC and others have continued to speak out and have been appearing in massive rallies all over America over the last 4 or 5 months, where even in red states, thousands of people have shown up. Very recently, the No Kings Day, where, according to satellite photos, Trump's military parade celebrating the 250th anniversary of the U.S. Army on his 79th birthday attracted just under 9,000 people. We all saw that on TV. And the No Kings Day protests, over 2,100 across the country, attracted variously estimated between 4 to 6 million people. And then comes the mayoral election in New York. And Zohran Mamdani. If you've seen him on the news, he's well-spoken, he's articulate, and he, like Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Cortez, Octavia Cortez, are speaking not only truth to power about Trump, but articulating basically an explicitly socialist message, which is essentially in its most reduced form a message that it's time for us to care for one another. It's time for the political structures to actually serve ordinary Americans and to make healthcare affordable, to make education affordable, to make childcare affordable. As Mamdani says, it costs more for healthcare right now in New York than to go to the City University of New York. That's outrageous that people who can't afford to stay home have to work, have kids, have to pay more than their salary for the childcare that enables them to work. That's the contradiction in a nutshell, my friends, for what has been replicated in every corner of the American polity as the internal middle class and the supporting infrastructure built by Franklin Delano Roosevelt has been systematically dismantled by the Republicans and the Democrats alike. There will be a ferocious attempt on the part of the Clintons, on the part of Schumer, on the part of Jeffries, the political elite of the Democratic Party, to make sure that Zohran Mamdani does not win as mayor of New York. So the same battle that happened in 2016 and 2020 is going to happen again in New York City. And we all need to understand that that's the playbook. That's what's going to happen. We'll see in the news media, on CNN and Fox News, you can't have a socialist in America. And there will be attacks on the fact he's from Uganda. There will be attacks on his character. There will be a vitriol about Mamdani, like there was against Bernie Sanders, the like of which we've not seen. Because if he wins, and there's the beginning of a coherent countervailing impulse in the American polity that is tapping into the very spiritual and I would say almost metaphysical groundings of the American promise to itself. What could begin to happen if you think forward to 2026 and 2028 is the beginnings of a renaissance, not only for the middle class, but could reshape the political consciousness in America. But what is required for that to happen is for us to use the L word and the S word without apology, to talk about affordability, to talk about what the government needs to do for the people, to support Medicare, to support Social Security, to turn out on the streets of this country in the next series of protests that are supposed to happen, as I understand it, around the 17th, 18th of July, to make sure that the glimmer becomes a critical mass, which would allow the Bernie Sanders and the AOCs of the world and the Mamdanis of the world to not only be empowered, but to articulate the very ideology that could save America from itself and from the tyrant. Because hatred, division, polarization, fear feeds the tyrant. Compassion inclusivity, fairness, feeds the elegance of the mind. And that's what's now taking shape in the soul of America. Let me close with just one observation. For any of you who may believe that this can't happen because, just because, I am struck by the plasticity of the human psyche. We saw it with COVID. Everybody was just kind of going along. And the next thing we knew in March of 2020, within a couple weeks of the World Health Organization declaring a pandemic, the governments of the world had shut everything down. Everybody was in their homes. Everybody was essentially under house arrest, isolation. It happened without a whimper, without a whimper. And in the space of literally weeks, humanity went to its opposite, from normalcy to complete absurd, abnormal behavior. And they kept it up for a couple of years, destroying lives, destroying economies, manipulating the public perception, putting vaccines out that were deleterious to human health. And the public kind of went along with it, although more and more discontent began to surface. And that has led now to looking back on the COVID regime in the same way we look back on the Iraq War. The weapons of mass destruction, the pandemic, were a fraud to perpetrate something that was not in the interests of the public. And therefore, the public had to be lied to and manipulated and coerced. But that shows you plasticity. We're seeing it again under Trump. The United States has represented globalization, free trade, international rule of law for 80 years. Most concertedly since the Reagan administration and beginning with Bill Clinton and the NAFTA agreement, etc. And now all of a sudden, Trump comes in and upends all of it. We go from free trade to tariffs. We go from the rule of law to the United States going to do anything it wants. We're in one inversion after another. And the public just shapeshifts with the leadership formation almost without missing a beat. So we know that nothing is written until we write it. We know that the public is just as capable of supporting a socialist agenda in America, which was what Franklin Delano Roosevelt built in the 1930s and 1940s, 1950s, all the way to President Johnson's Great Society program. That's what America supported. And beginning in the 1960s, when John Kennedy and Bobby Kennedy and Martin Luther King and Malcolm X were assassinated, and Richard Nixon employed his Southern strategy, the soul of America has been ripped apart by the politics of division. Till today, 2025, with Donald Trump, we're looking starkly at the possibility of the demise of the republic itself to tyranny. And right at that moment, up pops Mamdani. And while I don't want to overestimate that achievement, I want to underscore that if cultivated by courageous action on the part of tens of millions of Americans over the next months leading up to the 2026 election, it is possible, even probable, that the republic can be restored and the American people can return to who they most essentially are, people of goodwill who want to support one another in an inclusive democracy based on fairness and equity for all. So it's an extraordinary moment. It's an inflection moment. Let us seize it. Let us seize the day. Carpe diem. So thank you, everyone, for joining us today on Humanity Rising. It's always a pleasure to be with you. Over the next several weeks, I will be in France, attending to our annual pilgrimage to Chartres. I know many of you will be joining us. It's going to be an incredible time with Veda Austin on the living intelligence of water, and also Bertie Jaworski on remote viewing and contact with the cosmic intelligences that are with us. And so next Friday, we'll be having Victoria Moore and the Gaia education students at Ubiquity talking about all kinds of regenerative projects that they have in different places around the world. And then the following Friday, the 11th of July, Peter Mary will be talking about science and consciousness and the latest research indicating that consciousness is far more real and far more interesting than we have suspected up to the present moment. And then I'll be back the following week to Humanity Rising because I'll be returning to Washington, D.C. Thank you so much for joining us. You can join the after chat. I'll join for a few minutes, although I'm taking off to Washington, so I need to leave to the airport shortly. And you'll see the link in the chat box, and you receive the link in your Zoom reminders for today. But I want to just thank everybody for your support of our various programs that are solely motivated to enable humanity to rise. Thank you, everyone. Bye for now.